Take a look at our country's long-term challenges and take a look at the more immediate difficulties from growth to energy, and it's clear Britain needs reform. But do I mean Nigel Farage or something more fundamental? Welcome to The Week in Business with me, Christian May. Right, let's be clear. I'm not talking about Reform UK or Nigel Farage, though the insurgent's rise in popularity isn't hard to explain, and it's certainly related to the wider arguments I'm about to make. Now, I've often written and talked about the need for some radical thinking when it comes to our economy, but I'm a mere amateur, a hobbyist when compared with one of the biggest brains in the country. I refer to former Bank of England chief economist Andy Haldane. Haldane was one of the most senior figures at the Bank of England for decades, serving as chief economist from 2014 to 2021. And on Tuesday night, earlier this week, he addressed the City AM Awards at London's Guildhall. And that speech has got people talking. After the awards, which were an absolute blast, by the way, I got a lot of emails from guests saying how much they enjoyed it or how good the food was, and it was, thank you, Clink Charity. But most of all, I got people asking me either for a copy of Andy Haldane's speech or to be introduced to him. Nobody asked for a copy of my speech, by the way, but I'll let that slide. Some of the most senior people in the city and politics contacted me about Haldane's remarks, and I know for a fact that his observations delivered on that night are now being discussed at the highest levels in banks and government departments. So what did he say? Well, I'll give you a flavour, though you can find a full write-up on the City AM website. He basically summed up the British condition of the past 20 years as one of risk and risk aversion. Shocks, or nasties as he called them, including the financial crisis, the euro crisis, Brexit, COVID, war, and Trump's tariffs, have left individuals, governments, and investors hunkering down to avoid risk. Now, he described this as a perfectly natural inclination, but warned that the mindset has caused terrible damage, ranging from depressed business investment over decades to the erosion of UK equities on the balance sheets of UK pension funds. Now, strikingly, he drew a parallel with the time of the Great Depression and what economist John Maynard Keynes called the paradox of thrift, where, in Haldane's words, too much of a good thing, thrift, becomes a bad thing, depression. The question Haldane posed to the room that night was how we could go about breaking the cycle of doom and gloom and the toxic relationship between uncertainty, risk aversion, and low growth. A relationship that has baked in no or low returns, no or low investment, low or no growth. Now, different people will have different answers to this question, I understand that, often depending on their political priorities. For Haldane, part of the answer is to be found in revitalising a risk appetite across regulators, investors, and government. Speaking as someone who used to be one of the nation's top financial regulators, Haldane called for a radical slimming of regulations and regulators. He advocated cutting the number of regulators in half, something he said could be easily achieved without much difficulty. Now, as I've talked about many times on this show, the Prime Minister Keir Starmer claims to have regulation in his crosshairs, and he's blamed a morass of regulation for preventing billions of pounds more of investment from flowing into the UK economy, and he has vowed to sweep away red tape. However, while Haldane described the government's approach to deregulation as directionally right, he cautioned that words are cheap, and he called for more robust efforts to encourage risk, saying that seeking regulatory reform via exhortation and press release has little chance of success. He says Parliament needs to rewrite the very foundations of regulatory law to make it clear exactly what we want our watchdogs to do. He also called for a more robust industrial strategy, something the government plans to unveil shortly. Stimulating stuff, this, I'm sure you'll agree, and no wonder it's got the city talking. But there's more to this story. Andy was absolutely right that the pendulum has swung far too far, that we are risk averse. But that condition applies far beyond financial regulation and business activity. It has infected our politics too. And the truth is we need a much more ambitious conversation in this country about the size of the state, its functions, our tax burden, what we expect from government, and what we're prepared to pay for. Let's look at the context. In 2010, government spending as a proportion of GDP was 46%, having climbed steadily from a low of 35% in 1997. What became known as austerity under David Cameron saw a gradual decline of state expenditure, falling from 46% to about 39% by the end of 2020. COVID hits, and the government spends hundreds of billions of pounds in its response, taking state expenditure to a peak of 53% of our entire national output. When the pandemic receded, public spending fell, of course, but not back to its pre-pandemic level, not even close. By 2023, it had settled back to around 45%. We now know, post-spring statement, that public spending as a percentage of GDP will still be higher in the years ahead than at any time since 2010, and the public sector net borrowing will still be £8 billion higher over the next 5 years than was forecast last autumn. Public sector debt will also come in around £30 billion higher by 2030, far higher than was predicted even at the time of the last budget. That's the immediate headache for Rachel Reeves, who is almost certainly going to blow up her fiscal rules by the time of the next budget in October. That's a mess partly of the government's own making, but also it stems from that 20-year approach to our economy that Andy Haldane was talking about. The only person who tried in recent years to have this fight was, brace yourselves, Liz Truss. And on paper she wasn't far wrong, but she blew it totally, partly because she was muddled, trying to spend billions on paying everyone's energy bills at the same time, but also she got the politics dead wrong. There was no democratic consent for her agenda. And reform of this nature, or indeed reform of the opposite nature or a different nature, perhaps the left-wing response to this crisis, needs democratic consent. So who in British politics will attempt to have this conversation? It could be reform. It could be Kemi Badenoch's Tory party. But this is a conversation we can either choose to have now, or we can have it when demographics and economic reality forces it upon us. Andy Haldane started this conversation, or at least part of it, at our awards on Tuesday night, and it's time others joined in. Well, that's it from me this week. Stay up to date and in the know with the City AM app and cityam.com, and I will see you next week when perhaps we'll continue this conversation.